How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Thursday, Yom Hamishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Melissa in Great Neck, Bella in Florida, Yehuda in South Carolina, Lorraine in Texas, Pearl in Toronto, Canada. Welcome, Pearl. Joe in the Inland Empire, Paul in the Great Northwest, Lucy, Minnesota, Gail in Kansas City, Sharon in New Jersey, Lynn in Canada, Moshe in Brooklyn, Lester in Florida, Chaim in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Continuing this material, I love it. It's really interesting because it's so practical. And we just see it, right, in our tzitzit. What I'm wearing under, a fancier level, a fancier kind of tzitzit for everyday wear. And on our talises, on our prayer shawls, the halachas, the laws that we're reading about right now, we see them in practice on a daily basis. So we're continuing to talk about here at the beginning in the first Mishna of chapter 4, and our daf today is page 42. We're picking it up on near the bottom of page 41b here in tractate Menachot, the 30th volume of the Talmud. And this first Mishnah in chapter 4, right, is all about offerings and elements of an offering and elements of mitzvahs. Where if something is missing, the other elements that are present still do constitute a mitzvah, as opposed to the last Mishnah in chapter 3, where if any element is missing, then you're not accomplishing anything. Okay, near the bottom of page 41b. The sages taught in a baraisa, how many strings does one place on a garment? And Beis Shammai say 4 strings that are inserted into the hole in the garment, so that there are 8 strings hanging down altogether. And Beis Hillel say 3 strings are inserted into the garment, which when doubled would become 6. Unusual situation. Who do we follow? Beis Shammai. In most cases, when there's a dispute between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, we follow Beis Hillel, as we learned in tractate Eruvin years ago now. Why do we follow Beis Hillel? Because they were easygoing and forgiving, and they stated the opinions of Beis Shammai before their own. Right? Both views are Torah. Both views have good reasons for them, but we tend to follow Beis Hillel. In this, however, we follow Beis Shammai. So as you can see, here's a corner of a garment. This is one that has techelis, right? And as we mentioned yesterday, here's one that doesn't have techelis in it. But if you count the strings, right, it's 4 strings that are inserted. This is a case where it goes through 2 holes, which enables it to come out the front. When there's only 1 hole, it would go through and then be knotted out here. So the knot will be farther away from the hole when there's only 1 hole. But it's 4 strings that go through, then they get doubled and become 8 strings. One of the 4 strings is a techelis, is a blue string. So when they get doubled, as you can see, when they're hanging out, it's like there's 2 blue strings. I don't have my talis in my office right now, but on my talis, on my prayer shawl, you would only see 1 blue string among the 8. And we'll see in today's daf how that is accomplished, because it's like the blue is only on half of one of the strings, right? So it hangs down, it becomes the blue string, but the other half is white. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Okay, so Beis Hillel say 3 strings are inserted into the garment, but we follow Beis Shammai. And how much should be hanging beyond the knots and the windings, right? The knots here and here and here and here and here, and the windings are the loops, right, around the collected strings. So beyond the knots and the loops, or the knots and the windings, how much should be hanging, right? In other words, hanging loose, like this, right? So Beis Shammai, Are we talking about hanging loose here, or are we talking about between the first knot and the hole? Right? Those would be two different areas where we're beyond the knots and the windings. So how much should be hanging beyond the knots and the windings? Beis Shammai say 4 fingerbreadths, and Beis Hillel say 3 fingerbreadths. And 3 fingerbreadths, and the 3 fingerbreadths that Beis Hillel say should be hanging are each 1/4 of a hand breadth of an average person. And the Gemara notes that Rav Papa said that the hand breadth of the Torah is 4 fingerbreadths measured by the thumb, which would be 6 fingerbreadths as measured by the smallest finger, or 5 fingerbreadths measured by the third finger, right? So your thumb is wider than other fingers is what they're saying. So they're talking about how much is hanging beyond the knots, right? And so this is a little bit different than what we were saying yesterday, because yesterday we were talking about ideally, right, the knots and the windings is at least 1/3, and then beyond that is 2/3, or sometimes 1/4 and 3/4, which I think is closer to what I've got here. But at a minimum, you would have, about a hand breadth, right? So about that much beyond the knots and the windings. Now, Rav Huna says that the law is, one must attach 4 strings within 4 fingerbreadths of the edge of the garment, and they should hang down 4 fingerbreadths beyond the knots and the windings. And Rav Yehuda says one must attach 3 strings within 3 fingerbreadths of the edge of the garment, and they should hang down 3 fingerbreadths beyond the knots and the windings. And Rav Papa says that the law is that one must attach 4 strings within 3 fingerbreadths of the edge of the garment, and they should hang down 4 fingerbreadths beyond the knots and the windings. So the Gemara asks, is this to say that the tzitzis have a required measure? And the Gemara raises a contradiction to this from a baraisa. The verse states in Numbers 15:38 that they prepare for themselves strings and now they're translating tzitzis as strings. Often it's translated as fringes, but we're talking tzitzis. Now, strings, right, tzitzis, are nothing other than what emerges from the corner of the garment. And the term tzitzis indicates only that there must be strings of any length. And it already occurred that the elders of Beis Shammai and the elders of Beis Hillel ascended to the attic of Yochanan ben Beseira, and they discussed the matter, and they said, tzitzis have no measure. Similarly, a lulav has no measure. What do you mean it has no measure? Can it be 1 millimeter long? No, absolutely not. And we'll discuss that in a moment, that there's a minimum measure, but there's no maximum measure. You can have really long tzitzis, right? This is, I would say, pretty average length, pretty average. And there are some people who have them really long, especially if they are tall. You can have them made super long, so they hang down your leg. And some people joke around, that it's like a holier than thou type of attitude, that people have it really long are somehow showing off. And so other people don't want to have it overly long for that reason. But there is no maximum measure. And it's interesting they're comparing that to lulav. Right, so lulav is the palm branch that we wave along with the other 3 species on sukkahs. And, you have a pretty good sense if you've ever shaking your lulav, right, waving the 4 species at sukkahs. How big is a lulav? I mean, a palm branch, that hasn't really sprouted yet, they tend to be something like 30 inches to a yard long. But there's no maximum measure, and some of you may have seen videos from Israel. It's usually in Israel where you would see this. That on Sukkot, there's always that one guy at the Kosel, right, at the Western Wall in Jerusalem, who will come with a massive lulav. I mean, you see him in the videos like 20 feet high, for real, right? So it's like, palm branch that hasn't unfolded yet, but from a big palm tree. And there are just massive lulavs. I mean, really massive, like 10 feet high, 15 feet high, 20 feet high, just massive. And they'll usually couple that with a massive esrog, right? The citron fruit, which usually, we use it here outside of Israel, about the size of a lemon. Looks somewhat like a lemon too, but you can get big esrogim. And I've seen ones that look sort of like a watermelon. So carrying the massive lulav, the massive esrog. Okay, point is, no maximum measure compared to lulav. And when they say that in the attic of Yochanan ben Beseira, this was one of those times when the elders of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel came to agree on certain things. Now, what? Does this not mean that tzitzis have no required measure at all? And the Gemara answers, no, the Baraisa means that tzitzis do not have a maximum measure. Now we're at the top of page 42a. I.e., the strings can be as long as one wants, however, they do have a minimum measure. And if the strings are shorter than this measure, than the minimum measure, then they are not fit, and you are not fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzis. As if you do not say so, in a case similar to it, where it is taught that a lulav has no measure, is it possible that it also has no measure whatsoever? But didn't we learn in the Mishna in Tractate Sukkah 29b, a lulav that has 3 handbreadths in length is sufficient to enable one to wave with it. That's about a foot long. And it is fit for use in fulfilling the mitzvah. And this indicates that if the lulav is less than 3 handbreadths, right, less than about a foot long, it is not fit. So rather, it must be that a lulav has no maximum measure, but it does have a minimum measure, and so too, tzitzis have no maximum measure, but they do have a minimum measure. Now, the sages taught in a baraisa, the verse states that, quote, that they prepare for themselves tzitzis, right? Here translated as strings, right? So tzitzis can mean fringe, it can mean strings, depending on what, I hurt myself. Depending on what we're talking about is why the English translation varies a little bit. So the term tzitzis means nothing other than strings that hang down, anaf. And so it states in the verse, I was taken by a lock of my head. In Ezekiel 8:3, and here it says betzitzis, and he's talking about a hair lock, right? Like a lock of hair, but being described as a tzitzis. And Abaye says, and one is required to separate the tzitzis like a Gentile's lock of hair, part of which is braided and the rest of which is allowed to hang loose. This was apparently a pretty common hairstyle among the Romans at the time that the sages are writing about this, where part of the hair is braided and part is hanging loose. Some people wear their hair that way today too. Now, the sages taught in a baraisa, if one affixed the tzitzis to the tip of the corner or to the border, gadil, they are fit, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov disqualifies them in both cases. And the Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion is that which Rav Giddel says that Rav says, tzitzis must be inserted into a hole above the corner and hang down onto the corner of the garment, as it is stated on the corners of their garments. I think both of mine are done in this style. This is the Chabad style of attaching tzitzis, where you see that there are 2 holes, and so it can hang down like that, right? The first knot is right near the holes. That's what you accomplish by having 2 holes. If there was only 1 hole, which is, I want to show my belly. Let's see if I can stick this out like that. Right? So here, you see how it works a little bit differently, right? You only have 1 hole, so the strings hang down from that hole, and then the first knot is made beyond the corner, right? And you see the difference when you have 2 holes or when you have 1 hole. But this is that same idea that the hole itself has to be about this distance, 3 fingerbreadths from the edge of the garment, from the 2 edges, which places it at the corner. Since the Torah commands, you shall put these fringes on the corners of your garments. How do you know you're at the corner? Because you're within 3 fingerbreadths of the 2 edges where they meet. And then the loops, the strings go through and then start knotting and winding. Okay. Here we go. Okay. Where am I? Right. So the tzitzis must be inserted in a hole above the corner and hang down onto the corner of the garment as it is stated on the corners of their garments in Numbers 15:38. Now, in accordance with whose opinion is this? And the Gemara answers, it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Rabbi Yaakov says that Rabbi Yochanan says, and one must distance the hole through which the tzitzis are inserted into the garment, the length of a full thumb joint from the edge of the garment. And the Gemara notes, and it was necessary to state the ruling of Rav Papa that the tzitzis must be inserted into a hole within 3 finger breadths of the edge of the garment. And it was also necessary to state the ruling of Rabbi Yaakov. And this is because if the location of the hole was taught only from the statement of Rav Papa, I would say that his ruling that the hole must be within 3 finger breadths of the edge of the garment was to teach that one may not distance the hole from the edge of the garment by more than this amount. But the closer the hole is to the edge of the garment, the better. Consequently, it was necessary to include the statement of Rabbi Yaakov. And if the location of the hole was taught only from the statement of Rabbi Yaakov, I would say that his ruling that it must be a full thumb joint away from the edge was to teach that one may not situate the hole closer to the edge of the garment, but the further he places it, the better. Therefore, both statements were necessary, right? So minimum distance from the edge of the garment, a thumb joint. Maximum distance from the edge of the garment, 3 finger breadths. And if the location, I said that. Okay, so the Gemara relates that Ravina and Rav Sama were sitting before Rav Ashi. And Rav Sama saw, now Ravina and Rav Ashi, by the way, these are late sages in the period of the Talmud because Ravina and Rav Ashi are the editors of the Gemara. In the same way that Rebbe redacted the Mishna around the year 200 of the Common Era. That's when the Mishna closed and the next level of commentary began, which is the Gemara. And the Gemara plus the Mishna equals the Talmud. So the sages who finally sort of redacted and edited and put together the Gemara as a commentary in the Mishnah were Rav Ashi and sounds like his student Ravina. I'm not sure exactly what their relationship was, but it says that Ravina was sitting before Rav Ashi. And so Ravina and Rav Ashi put it together, and so the period of the Gemara closed around the year 500 of the Common Era. And then once you get past that, then you're talking about the next stage of commentary, which is commentary on the Talmud, but not the Talmud itself. Okay. Where am I? That's called the Geonim, and then beyond them is the Acharonim. Okay. So Ravina and Rav Sama were sitting before Rav Ashi, and Rav Sama saw that the corner of Ravina's cloak was torn, and therefore the hole through which the tzitzis were inserted was less than the full length of a thumb joint from the edge of the garment. So Rav Sama said to Ravina, doesn't the master hold in accordance with that statement of Rabbi Yaakov that the hole must be at least the length of a thumb joint from the edge of the garment? And Ravina said to Rav Sama, it was stated that the distance is required at the time when the tzitzis are made. If the corner tears later, causing the hole to be closer to the edge of the garment, the ritual fringes remain fit. Right? So there's going to be some wear and tear on the garment, but you start with the hole between a thumb joint and 3 finger breadths away from the edge of the garment. If the hole opens up a little bit and it moves closer to the edge, that doesn't render the tzitzis unfit. At a certain point, it's going to be too damaged and it will be unfit, but not just a little bit of movement in that direction. Now, Rav Sama became embarrassed because he had asked his question based on a mistaken assumption. So Rav Ashi said to Rav Sama, do not be upset that Ravina is a greater scholar than you are. One of them, i.e. the sages of Eretz Yisrael, is like 2 of us, i.e. the sages of Babylonia. Now, with regard to attaching the tzitzis to a garment, The Gemara relates that Rav Acha bar Yaakov would affix 4 strings to the garment, and he would first fold them in half and then insert them at the point of the folds into the hole of the garment, so that on one side there were 8 strings and on the other side there were 4 loops. And then he would take the 8 strings and loop them through the 4 loops and pull them tight, thereby attaching them to the garment. So that is not what we do, right? That is not what we do now. Although there are different methods of tying tzitzis, and I don't know if one of the other traditions and the ones I'm familiar with does it that way, but that's kind of like... this idea, now imagine that this was 4 strings, right? And then you fold them in half like this, right? And then you stick it through a hole. Stick it through a hole. And then you pull what's hanging, right, through the loop. And you go like that, right? So if you started with 4 strings that were folded in half to create 8, and then you made this looping thing. So now you would have 8 strings hanging through here, and they would be attached quite securely up here, but they would also pull the garment, cinch it, like really, it would fold up and go right up to the hole, and that's probably a reason why this did not become normative, at least in most traditions. Loop them through, and then he would pull them tight, thereby attaching them to the garment. And the Gemara explains that he held that we require 8 strings when they are initially placed in the garment, in order that there be twisted cord and twisted cords, i.e. 4 doubled strings at the place, i.e. the time, when he creates the loose hanging string. Rav Yirmi of Difti would affix 8 strings that are 16 strings after they were placed in the hole of the garment, and half of each string hangs down on each side, and he would not loop them, as Rav Acha bar Yaakov did. Mar, the son of Ravina, would prepare tzitzis like ours, placing 4 strings through the hole and allowing both ends of the string to hang down, thereby forming 8, and then starting the knots. And this is them talking 1,500 years ago and saying like we do, but it is like we do. Okay, next topic. The Gemara relates that Rav Nachman found Rav Ada bar Ahava affixing strings to a garment and reciting the blessing that concludes to prepare tzitzis. So Rav Nachman said to Rav Ada bar Ahava, "What is this tzitzis sound that I hear?" This is what Rav says. Tzitzis do not require a blessing when one attaches them to the garment. Right? So that's very interesting. And as we'll see in sukkahs, right, when we wave the 4 species, right, the palm branch, the willow branch, the myrtle branch, and the esrog, citron in English, when we're putting them together, right, when we are binding the branches to each other, which is a bit of a process, do we say a blessing at that time? No, we say the blessing of waving the lulav, of waving the 4 species at Sukkot, on Sukkot when we pick them up and perform the mitzvah. So when we're tying tzitzis to a garment, do we say a blessing at that time? No. We say the blessing when we put tzitzis on our body. I think likewise when somebody is manufacturing tefillin, he doesn't say a blessing. We say the blessing over fulfilling the commandment of tefillin when we wrap the tefillin on our body, right? We say the blessing over a mitzvah. Those are the blessings that always start with, "Bless you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to," and then do what we do, right? But for the mitzvah of tzitzis is when we're wearing the tzitzis on our body. So when we put tzitzis on in the morning, that's when we make that bracha about performing the mitzvah of tzitzis, not when we tie tzitzis onto the garment. So with regard to this statement of Rav, the Gemara relates that when Rav Huna died, Rav Chisda went into the study hall to raise a contradiction from one statement of Rav to another statement of Rav, as follows. Did Rav actually say that tzitzis do not require a blessing when one initially attaches them to a garment? But doesn't Rav Yehuda say that Rav says, from where is it derived that tzitzis attached by a non-Jew are unfit? It is derived from a verse, as it is stated, speak unto the children of Israel and command them that they prepare for themselves for tzitzis. In Numbers 15:38. So the sages derive from here that the children of Israel shall prepare tzitzis, but the non-Jews, the Gentiles, shall not prepare tzitzis for us. Right? Non-Jews are not obligated to wear tzitzis. It's not for them. Right? This is a commandment on us, and we're the ones who need to actually put the tzitzis together. Now the Gemara asks, but what is the contradiction between these two statements of Rav? Rav Yosef said the Rav Chisda held that in the case of any mitzvah for which the necessary item is fit when produced by a Gentile, if it is produced by a Jew, he does not need to recite a blessing. Conversely, any mitzvah for which the necessary item is unfit when produced by a Gentile, if it is produced by a Jew, he needs to recite a blessing when he produces the item. Not when he puts it on his body, but when he manufactures the item, i.e. when he ties the tzitzis onto the garment. So sounds like tzitzis placed on a garment, right? A tzitzis garment prepared by non-Jews is unfit for use by Jews. Therefore, when a Jew creates that garment, he should say the bracha, he should say the blessing according to this principle. So why is it that Rav said we don't say that blessing? So the Gemara asks, and is this an established principle? But what about bris, right? Circumcision, bris milah, which is valid if performed by a Gentile, as it is taught in a baraisa, in a city in which there is no Jewish doctor, and in which there is an Aramaean, which is a non-Jew doctor, or a Samaritan doctor, who is also a non-Jew. It is preferable that the Aramaean circumcise the Jewish boys of the city and the Samaritan not circumcise them. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Yehuda says it is preferable that the Samaritan circumcise the boys and the Aramaean not circumcise them. But the point being, for our argument here, it seems that they all agree that a circumcision performed by a Gentile is valid, right? Now, when Jews get their sons circumcised, you bring in a moil, right, who's not just a Jew, but who is a highly trained individual, who is an expert, not just in, the medical practice of circumcision, but all of the mitzvahs and laws of circumcision that are associated with it. So how can you say that a non-Jew can perform a circumcision? Says the Gemara, and despite the fact that a circumcision performed by a Gentile is valid, when it is performed by a Jew, he must recite a blessing. As the Master says, the one who circumcises his child says, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us through his mitzvahs and has commanded us concerning the circumcision." Right? The father says that, or the one who circumcises the child says it. And that is because, right? Why? Because circumcision, we don't say a blessing on that every day. We do it when we perform the circumcision. Now that's distinguished from tzitzis, where we say the blessing every day when we put the tzitzis on our body, or tefillin, when we say the blessing when we put the tefillin on our body. The circumcision was placed on our body permanently once, right? So that's when the blessing was stated. The point here is, okay, but it's valid if done by a non-Jew, and yet when a Jew does that circumcision, when it performs it on the boy, he says the blessing. So that would seem to contradict the principle that we just learned, that something that is valid when done by a non-Jew, when a Jew does it, he doesn't say a blessing. If it's not valid when done by a non-Jew, then when a Jew does it, he says the blessing. And the Gemara answers, is there reason to resolve the contradiction according to anyone but Rav? Rav himself invalidates circumcision performed by a Gentile. It cannot be performed by a Gentile. As it was stated, from where is it derived that circumcision performed on a Jew by a Gentile is not valid? Daru Bar Papa says in the name of Rav, this is derived from the verse, and God said unto Abraham, and as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your seed after you throughout their generations. And the verse indicates that only the descendants of Abraham, the Jewish descendants, right, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because obviously there are non-Jews who are descendants of Abraham, but it's the descendants of Abraham in the Jewish line that must perform the circumcision, right? And where does this law end up? I'll just read it to you from Shulchan Aruch. A Gentile may not perform a circumcision, even if he himself is circumcised. If he did perform the circumcision, it is valid after the fact, and nothing further needs to be done to the child. This is in accordance with the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, who disagree with Rav. Some explain that it is valid because circumcision does not need to be performed for the sake of the mitzvah. The Rima adds that some hold that the circumcision is invalid even after the fact, and one must therefore draw blood from the location of the circumcision, by a Jew, if the circumcision was originally done by a non-Jew. So the point is, when Jews circumcise their sons, it needs to be done by a Jew. But if it's done by a non-Jew, it's valid after the fact. But just to satisfy all opinions, because this is such an important matter, if it was like a medical circumcision done in a hospital, by a non-Jewish doctor, so then later they'll just make a little nick, like literally draw one drop of blood from the location of the circumcision, which would be like a symbolic, finishing of the circumcision and done by a Jew. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan says that this law is derived, that a Jew must do a circumcision, from the doubled verb in the verse, must be circumcised, himnol, yimnol, right, must be circumcised. This is mila, is how we say circumcision, and so this is one of those doublings, which he interprets to mean only one who is circumcised, hamal, may circumcise, yamul, others. Obviously, there are Gentiles who are not circumcised, who are circumcised, but in the ancient world, that was very uncommon. The Gemara notes that the law with regard to a sukkah supports the opinion of Rav Chisda, who holds that when an item used for a mitzvah can be created by a Gentile, a Jew who creates it does not recite a blessing. And the law with regard to tefillin is a conclusive refutation of his opinion. Again, like the sukkah, you can have non-Jews put up your sukkah, and you don't say a blessing, and obviously they don't say a blessing, and it will still be a valid sukkah. When do we say a blessing on the sukkah? When we enter it during sukkahs and perform the mitzvah of dwelling in the booths, right, dwelling in the sukkah during the festival of sukkahs. We don't say a blessing on the construction of the sukkah. The Gemara explains a sukkah is fit even if it was built by a Gentile, as it is taught in a brisa, with regard to a booth built by Gentiles, a booth built by women, a booth for domesticated animals, a booth built by Samaritans, a booth of any sort. Each is fit for use as a sukkah, provided that it is roofed in accordance with the law. In other words, it doesn't matter who built it, as long as the way it's built satisfies the requirements of a sukkah. And if a sukkah was built by a Jew, he is not required to recite a blessing upon its construction, as it is taught in a brisa. One who constructs a sukkah for himself recites, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has given us life, sustained us, and brought us to this time." That's when you start dwelling in the sukkah during sukkahs. When he comes to sit in the sukkah, he recites, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us through his commandments and commanded us to reside in the sukkah." Again, that's the blessing we say during the festival of Sukkot. And the Gemara notes that the Baraisa indicates that he recites a blessing at the time of construction, whereas he does not recite a blessing including the words "to construct a sukkah," and this confirms the opinion of Rav Chisda. Now, by contrast, the law with regard to tefillin is a conclusive refutation of Rav Chisda's opinion. Tefillin are unfit when written by a Gentile, as it is taught by Rav Chinana, the son of Rava, of Pashronia. A Torah scroll, tefillin, or mezuzahs that were written by a heretic, a Samaritan, a Gentile, a Canaanite slave, a woman, a minor, or a Jewish apostate are unfit, as it is stated, and you shall bind them for a sign on your arm, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house. Now, from this juxtaposition, one can derive the following. Anyone who is included in the mitzvah of wrapping tefillin, i.e. one who is both obligated and who performs the mitzvah, is included in the class of people who may write the Torah scrolls and the tefillin. Now we're talking about the scrolls inside the leather boxes of tefillin and mezuzahs. And anyone who is not included in the mitzvah of binding is not included in the class of people who may write these sacred texts. We're on page 42b now. And despite the fact that tefillin written by a Gentile are unfit, a Jew who writes them does not recite a blessing at the time of writing them. As Rav Chia, the son of Rav Huna, sent a ruling in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, on tefillin of the arm, one says the blessing, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, the ruler of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to wrap tefillin." On the tefillin of the head, if one says a separate blessing like Ashkenazim do, you say, "Blessed are you, ruler of the universe. Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the mitzvah of tefillin." So the implication of this is that one recites blessings only when he puts on the tefillin, whereas when he writes the tefillin, he does not recite a blessing along the lines of to prepare, to make, right, to construct the tefillin. So, rather, isn't this the reason for the distinction between different mitzvahs? For any mitzvah, right, for any commandment whose performance is the completion of the mitzvah, like a circumcision, even though it is valid when performed by a Gentile, when it is performed by a Jew, he must recite a blessing. But for any mitzvah where the performance of a particular act is not the completion of the mitzvah, such as writing tefillin, where one does not complete the mitzvah until he puts them on his body, even though it is not valid when performed by a Gentile, when it is performed by a Jew, he does not need to recite a blessing, right? So the fact that it is valid or not valid when done by a Gentile is an important aspect of the law, but it is not dispositive on whether one says a blessing when writing it or when constructing it. The answer to the question of do we say a blessing, when we manufacture, when we produce that object, the answer is not if it's going to be another step before it can be actually performed as a mitzvah. So when you write tefillin, you don't say the blessing. When you put the tefillin on your body, you say the blessing. When you tie tzitzis, you don't say a blessing. When you put the garment on your body that has tzitzis on it, that's when you say the blessing of tzitzis. Rav Mordechai said to Rav Ashi, "You teach this law about Gentiles attaching tzitzis to a garment in this manner, citing Rav Yehud in the name of Rav that tzitzis are not valid. Consequently, Rav Chisda raises a contradiction between this ruling and another ruling of Rav. We teach it a different way. We teach it this way, according to which there is no contradiction. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, from where is it derived that if tzitzis are attached to a garment by a Gentile, they are valid? It is derived from that which is stated. Speak unto the children of Israel and command them that they prepare for themselves lachem, strings, right, tzitzis. From the fact that the verse does not merely state that they prepare, but rather states that they prepare for themselves, which can be translated as that they prepare for them, the indication is that even others, meaning Gentiles, can prepare tzitzis for them. But that's not the way it's done. Now, Rav Yehuda says that Rav says if one prepared tzitzis from threads that protrude from the fabric like horns, like thorns, kotzim, or if he prepared them from threads, nimin, that were used to sew the garment and remain attached to it, or from the strings that hang from the bottom of a garment, the tzitzis are unfit. Right? So in other words, remember that, we're so accustomed to, this shirt or a t-shirt or a dress shirt. And the clothing that we wear in modern times are woven by machine from very fine thread. The garments that they wore in ancient times were woven, probably on a loom, but of much coarser thread than we are used to. Right? I mean, think like a burlap bag. That's the texture of the garments that most people were wearing at that time. And so the strings that sort of hang off the end of an unfinished woven fabric that comes off a loom are very similar in thickness to the strings of tzitzis. And so what they're saying is, well, if he was weaving it in this way and then he left a bunch of strings, hanging off the end, he didn't cut those. It's like they're already part of the garment and you just leave them long and put some knots in them. Is that, it's a different way, maybe an easier way or an interesting way to have tzitzis on the corner of a garment. But it would not be fit because that's just leaving some strings long that are already woven into the part of the weave of that fabric. Tzitzis need to be separate strings, that are placed through a hole in the corner and then tied, or it's not valid. That's what we're learning here. They would be unfit. But if he prepared tzitzis from swatches of wool that were not spun for the sake of the mitzvah, they are fit. Now Rabbi Yehuda continues, when I stated this law in the name of Rab before Shmuel, he said to me, even tzitzis tied from swatches of wool that were not spun for the sake of the mitzvah are unfit, as we require the spinning of the string to be for the sake of the mitzvah. Right? So ideally, the strings that are going to end up being used as tzitzis on a garment, from the start, they were manufactured for the purpose of being tzitzis. You don't harvest leftover strings from some other, some weaving that you didn't finish into a garment. And you say, what, I'll just use this. It's not going to work out. I'm not going to make a garment out of this. I'll repurpose these strings as tzitzis. According to this view, they would be unfit. And the Gemara notes that this dispute is like a dispute between Tanaim, as it is taught in a baraisa, if one took tefillin and coated them with gold or patched them with the skin of a non-kosher animal, they are unfit. But if one patched them with the skin of a kosher animal, then they are fit, and this is so even though he did not prepare the skin for their sake, i.e. for the sake of its use in a mitzvah. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, even if he patched them with the skin of a kosher animal, they are unfit until he patches them with skin that was prepared from an animal for the sake of tefillin, right? Similar dispute. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Whoa. Abaye said to Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda, how do you dye the techelis, right, the sky blue wool, to be used for tzitzis? So Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda said to Abaye, we bring blood of a chilazon, right, this is a particular type of sea snail, very specific, and various herbs, and put them in a pot and boil them. And then we take a bit of the resulting dye in an eggshell and test it by using it to dye a wad of wool to see if it has attained the desired color. And then we throw away that eggshell and its contents and burn the wad of wool, right? Because what was used for testing the color, that can't be used to then go dye actual tzitzis with techelis, because it would be repurposing something that wasn't made for the mitzvah. That's why the little batch for testing gets thrown away. Now the Gemara comments, learn from this statement 3 laws. Learn from it that wool that was dyed for the purpose of testing the dye and not for use of tzitzis is unfit for tzitzis. Consequently, one burns the wad of wool so that no one will use it for tzitzis. And learn from it that we require dyeing for the sake of the mitzvah, and learn from it that using dye for testing renders all the dye in that testing vessel unfit. Therefore, some of the dye is removed from the pot before it is tested. Now, the Gemara challenges, because if you tested it directly from the pot, you would render everything that you had created unfit. Now the Gemara challenges the law, the halacha, that wool dyed for the purpose of testing the dye is unfit, is the same as the requirement of dyeing for the sake of the mitzvah. It is only because the sky blue strings must be dyed for the sake of the mitzvah that wool dyed as a test is unfit for use as tzitzis. So why are these stated as two separate laws? It's really the same law. And Rav Ashi said the statement about learning three laws employs the style known as, what is the reason? And it means, what is the reason that wool that was dyed for the purpose of testing is unfit? It is because we require that dyeing for the sake of the mitzvah, that the dyeing be done only for the sake of the mitzvah, not for the sake of testing the color. So the Gemara notes that the law that using the dye for testing renders all the dye in the pot unfit, if you took it testing right from the pot, is subject to a dispute between Tanaim. As it is stated in a Baraisa, techeles dye that was used for testing is unfit, as it is stated concerning the priestly vestments. And you shall make the robe of the ephod, and I'm talking about the robe of the high priest, right, the Kohen Gadol. And you shall make the robe of the ephod entirely of techelis, this blue dye, wool dyed this color blue, which indicates that the dye must be used exclusively for this purpose, i.e. this must be the first item that is being used to dye. This is a statement of Rabbi Hanina ben Gamliel. Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavai says, even a second appearance caused by the dye is fit, meaning even if it is the second time that the dye is being used, it is still fit. As it is stated in the verse, and scarlet wool, ushni tala'at, in Leviticus 14:4, which is interpreted to mean that this may be the second sheni, like ushni, sheni, may be the second use of the dye, but beyond the second use, it would be unfit. That is where we will stop. I'm going to take a couple of comments. Let me get my glasses. And a reminder that we'll have class tomorrow, Friday, regular Friday time, noon Pacific. Saturday night, regular Saturday time after Shabbos ends in LA, probably 7:30ish. And then I head to Israel, God willing, for the premieres in Jerusalem, Netanya, Gush Etzion, and Tel Aviv of Guns N' Moses. I'll be gone for a week. And so we won't have class Sunday until the following Tuesday, I think would be, which is Purim. So we'll publish the schedule of when exactly we're going to be back. But things could change. There's a big U.S. naval presence in the Middle East. Could definitely affect Israel. The citizens of Israel, have been told, have communication channels open. There may be communications coming. We will see. I talked to a member of my family who lives there today. For him, just based on somebody who lives there, saying 50-50, something will happen. We'll see. My plan is, with God's help, to go to Israel, to be there for the Israeli premiere and the Q&As that follow. And so if it all goes according to schedule, I'll be gone for about 9 days. And so like I said, class tomorrow, Friday, and Saturday. That's no reason to expect that will change. Always when we talk about the future, we say God willing. But there's no reason to suppose anything but like that will happen. And then I should be leaving on Sunday, etc., spend the week in Israel. But if something changes, we'll let you know. And the place where we announce these kinds of changes is always the Facebook page, Accidental Talmudist. Okay. Says Annette Garasi Leitzen, what is the purpose of this with the strings, right? What is the purpose of the tzitzis, right? So this is one of the situations where God commands us to do something and tells us why we're doing it, right? So there are many commandments that we just are told what to do, and we do it because God said so, and that's good enough reason. And then Rambam, right, Maimonides, encourages us, even though God doesn't state the reason in the Torah, and ultimately we don't really know why we're doing it, we're just doing it because God said so. Nevertheless, we should dwell on it and study and try to figure out what is the purpose of every mitzvah. Sometimes it's easier to figure out than others. there is an overall purpose to kind of separate us, that Jews are a people apart, right? And we have all kinds of practices that keep us separate so that we will remain a distinct people, even if we live in other nations. And we cover our heads, and we wear tzitzis. So it has this one purpose is to keep us, distinct. Another purpose is just to do it because God said so. But in the case of tzitzis, God says that you will tie these strings on the corner of your garments so that whenever you look at the tzitzis, you will be reminded of all my commandments and to do them, right? So God says that the human is a forgetful creature. The human naturally is a selfish creature who pursues his own desires like any other mammal. We are thinking mammals, but we still are so often, right, give in to our bodily desires and just go do what we want when we want. And so it's a great practice. God is teaching us that when you're trying to improve yourself and adhere to a higher code and get things done that are going to make you that man or woman that you're striving to be in this world, that you should give yourself a constant reminder that will help you stay on that path. And tzitzis are meant to be that sort of reminder, right? And that's why some people will always wear their tzitzis outside their garments because, if you're not seeing it, how effective is it going to be at being that reminder for you? And not everybody wears them out because the purpose, wearing them out, that's not necessarily a commandment. It is the stated reason. It's a good reason to wear them out, but that itself is not required, and some people have reasons not to wear them out. But that's why we wear tzitzis. Sharon says, so I buy pre-cut tzitzis untied from Zion Talis in Israel. Would those strings have to be cut by a Jew? I assume these are, by the way, but I am curious. You mean like when they're manufactured, like when they're actually being spun, cut, tied, packaged, sent to you, etc. Sounds like if they weren't, it would be valid, but it is way better that this thing is handled by Jews from the get-go. I think it needs to be done by Jews, but after the fact, if certain parts of it are done by non-Jews, it'll still be valid. But like I said at the beginning, right? These are laws that affect us every day. But there's a lot of laws that are complex. And so, we don't paskin halakha from the Gemara. When you have a question like that, talk to your local Orthodox rabbi and ask him what the ruling is. Because there's just a lot of nuance when it comes to tzitzis. And, there are different answers. Chabad tzitzis look different than Ashkenaz tzitzis, look different than Rambam tzitzis, look different than Yemenite tzitzis. There are a lot of customs where there are slight nuanced differences, and that would produce different answers to certain questions, and that's why you got to consult your rabbi for these kinds of things. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Friday, regular Friday time, noon Pacific. Have a good night.